I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. All right, folks, we're coming at you live from the University of San Diego. I'm so excited. As many of you know, I loved college and still love it. I had such a good time here. So when I was thinking about who to have on the podcast, and, I like to kind of come up with different ideas and give you all different perspectives. One thought kept coming into mind when I see all this stuff on the media. I'm like, God, I wish I knew what Del Rio was thinking about this right now. I wish I could sit in his class and he could tell me, because I took a class called Media and Conflict, and that one stands out to me. But he taught a lot of different ones, and it was just kind of how we perceive the news and how, I don't know, all the classes about persuasion and propaganda and all the things. As much as I can remember, but I reached out to him and he said yes. So sitting with me is Esteban Del Rio, PhD. Hi.
Hey, Rachel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm coming off an adrenaline high because when I reached out to you to do the podcast, you said yes. And you said, well, while you're here, do you want a guest lecture? Mm-hmm. So I just did my guest lecture. Did I do okay?
It was wonderful.
Oh.
It was wonderful. A room full of mostly 18 and 19-year-olds who were rapt with attention about what you taught them.
Yeah, it was fun. It was freshman students, week 3, mm-hmm. and it was a pop culture class, but I wasn't teaching pop culture because obviously I didn't study the books that you're teaching.
Although everything's popular culture in some way,
That's true. That's true. But yeah, I kind of talked about my career path and the windy roads, and I think if I could impart one thing, it was that I've never done anything for my resume. I do things because I want to do them, and then they lead to something else. And hopefully that's the message that they got. But that's, for those listening, that's what I tried to drive home. So it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a good message for them. So many young people, and we might end up talking more about this,
yep.
are under so much pressure to know exactly what they're going to do with the rest of their life,
Oh, I think we all remember that. And those damn accounting majors were the only ones that knew. And I had some trouble with my flight, I think, if you're following me on Instagram. So I did wake up at 4:30 in the morning this morning. So this might be a little bit of a loopy episode. We'll see what happens. We're going to do something obviously pretty different. We'll talk to Del Rio a little bit about his history and kind of why he got into this, but mostly we're going to spend some time talking on how we consume media differently now, how it's become really divisive, and how do we trust the media? Those are going to be kind of our big topics here. And we're going to close out talking about college. I know I said I liked it, but I think there's a lot of controversy of whether it's necessary nowadays, how expensive it is nowadays. So I thought getting your perspective on it would be helpful. So are you ready? Let's get started.
Good.
Okay, first of all, you are from San Diego. You went to the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and you've been teaching media and cultural studies at USD since 2001. Mm-hmm. I was here 2007, 2011. So you have been here quite some time. What made you decide to get into not only this profession of teaching, but also specifically media and culture?
Yeah, I mean, as an undergrad, as a young person, I would have never guessed I'd become a college professor. I think something happened in the 90s. There was an anti-immigration proposition that passed in California. I'm Mexican-American. And my third generation, my grandparents came up in the 19-teens and 20s. But there was something that happened, it was called Proposition 187 in 1994 that passed in California. And it just used this same kind of anti-immigrant, alarmist, nativist, racist messages that we still see today. And at the time, it was really kind of scary in how it resembled propaganda from the 30s. And so that just got, I got, as a young person, kind of finding out who I was and what life was all about, to see so many messages for this proposition that made people like me look like we were invaders and we didn't belong and we're the problem. That really got me interested in thinking about things more critically, especially about how images and stories shape how people think about things, because the proposition passed in California. California is not the kind of liberal bastion that people think of it today, even though it's not all the way that way today. We had Republican governors. There's, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon from California. So it's much more of a mixed kind of political environment. But yeah, the messages upset me as a young person, and I thought I should think about this a little bit more. My girlfriend at the time in college went out to Massachusetts, and I missed her, and I entered the PhD program out there. But
real reason.
Yeah. But to be honest, I think that was my story for a long time. But I think I'm disempowering myself when I told that story. The fact of the matter was that she went out to Western Massachusetts, and I visited her a few times, and the conversations I was in, they just were thrilling. And the conversations with other graduate students, with professors, with people in the town in Northampton, Massachusetts, so different from where I grew up here in San Diego. It was just very exciting. And I really wanted to study communication, and I was a history major as an undergrad, but it just became like a very urgent set of questions. And so that's really what happened. And, the fact that I got to be reunited with my partner was fun too.
Bonus. Yeah.
We're still together. And, in the spring of 2001, someone from USD, the chair at the time, sent me a message and said, we have this visiting gig. Would you be interested in applying for it? And I had just defended, kind of a preliminary part of my PhD dissertation. I was going to undertake a whole bunch of research the following summer. And I probably could have used another year in Massachusetts, but I jumped at the chance to come back home. Mm-hmm. And that was 2001. And just to kind of, finish this thought about, kind of how I got to do what I do, I showed up in the fall of 2001, and I had this class assigned to me called Media and Conflict. And I was kind of scratching my head. I got syllabi from the way that people taught about it before. And, a lot of it was based in scandals in the 90s, the Clinton sex scandals, talk shows, listeners might remember like Jerry Springer and Ricky Lake, this whole kind of way that media was becoming much more salacious. At the time we talked about it, it was kind of like the Murdochization of television, kind of using Sky and Fox as a kind of model for like giving the audience more what they wanted instead of, leading people to think about things differently. And then I showed up. So I built my syllabus and I showed up for the first day, which was September 11th, 2001.
Oh,
yeah. And we, being on the West Coast, the university stayed open. They carted, students would never recognize these now, but, the televisions on the cart,
yep.
The CRTs with the VCR, and people watched what was happening. And the conversation of that class really kind of shaped that class. And when you took it, the way I teach it now. And so just like the stakes in understanding messages and meanings around things, it's functional in business and nonprofit and the law and government. We are always thinking about messages and how to shape the meaning of things, and how to persuade people, how to get everybody on the same page. And that's what communication studies, across contexts. But also the stakes are so high. It really does. Understanding communication and messages and media and culture very much has a lot to do with whether or not we show love for each other, whether or not we can recognize the whole humanity of people, or if we see each other as just a person in a box and of an identity. So, that's kind of what has driven my teaching and my research and ultimately my career since then.
Yeah. Communication to me feels very similar to human behavior, and obviously that plays into events. But one kind of small, simple example is that we read the positive command. So do not remove your card. People read remove your card, and you have to go back to do not. And you don't say don't run, you say please walk. Another one is people, instead of saying can I help you, instead of saying do you need help, because people don't want to admit that they need help, saying can I help you?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, I guess I'll let you help me. Anyway, it's small things like that I think are fascinating, especially with my flight stuff. I've saw how different people react to very frustrating situations and how customer service agents handle that. So anyway, it all plays into human behavior.
It does.
Okay, so speaking of those conversations that you're having, we're going to have one here about some similar stuff. So the role of media and the types of media that we consume have changed over the past few decades. We all know this. We're now getting news from TikTok. There's just more news everywhere, and it's a lot faster. What have you noticed changing the most, and kind of what concerns you about that?
Yeah, I mean, anybody who is attentive to the way that we get messages, who are on social media, who used to have a newspaper subscription, it's an incredibly visible change. And it brings opportunities and it brings constraints, just like anything. And I have to be careful as an aging Gen Xer not to dip into nostalgia about how things were before social media, certainly before, misinformation and disinformation became rampant in the 2010s and into now. And it's easy to go back, and for listeners who remember, there's, 3 and then 4 networks where you watched shows and got the news, and the newspaper came in the morning. In some cities, the newspaper came in the morning, another one came in the afternoon. So I don't want to be nostalgic about it, but it was easier to kind of like track what was happening. There were certainly so many exclusions in the kind of legacy media world. There's far fewer people of color whose stories are represented, queer people, immigrants, it was incredibly biased. And so the way the issues were defined was, for a specific kind of reader, viewer, listener. And other perspectives were just like not really part of the national or regional or local story, So there was a culture of news following that had a lot to do with just the reduced number of outlets. I think about like the material evidence of news, where there were newspaper machines. And, you don't have to go too far back to remember if you went into a coffee shop, there were always discarded papers. Usually it was in a place you'd go and, the Times, the Post, like it's here. And you could sit down with your coffee and reread what somebody already read. Some will remember the libraries with the big stick, that held the newspaper, and you can go into the reading room and read it.
That one, but yeah, okay.
Read, the Financial Times or something like that. So, but not only that, not only the newspaper machines, the discarded newspapers that you could pick up, the magazine that you had tucked in your bag or under your arm, but even things like, walking through a department store and being able to see a bank of televisions on the sales floor, and they would have a news person on there, Connie Chung or, Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite. So I think that's probably one of the big changes that I think is underappreciated, is that there used to be in decades past just like evidence of like material evidence of news. And so like news gathering was more of a routine and a habit. When the paper would arrive in the morning, it was there, and people would read it. People would sit down and watch the 6 o'clock news together often, and we just don't have that materiality of news anymore. It's in the ether. It's floating around. It might show up, and this, we might talk a little bit more about this later, but, it leads to this kind of like attitude that majority of Americans, and, I haven't seen any international studies, but it's probably the case. They don't follow the news anymore. There's not like a culture of news gathering. And that kind of goes together with like a lot of other really challenging.
Because you're saying instead of people going out and searching for the news is finding them.
That's right. That's
what I was looking at.
Yeah. In fact, there's a whole research program when it's exactly this language, news finds me. And there's a number of scholars, and they're studying this all around the world, that are finding that this attitude, I don't need to actually go find out what's happening. If something's happening that's important, I'm sure I'll hear about it, Which
is kind of scary, because then there are algorithms that are, for me, if I go on TikTok, there's certain news stories that I am going to be fed, and I'm going to think that I know what's going on in the news because I opened up my TikTok, but I didn't go out and seek out a whole newspaper to read all the articles to find what I think is interesting, which is sort of playing into what I think you were alluding to is, do we give the people, I remember this from your class, do we give the people what they should know, or do we give them what they want? Because what they want is obviously like sex sells and scandal sells and, conflict sells, but this boring article about an acquisition is probably what they need to know. Yeah. So, I feel like that's kind of just gotten, I don't want to say worse, but that hasn't gone away.
I think it's gotten worse. I think it's
cool.
I think,
cool.
There's kind of the division is, leading the audience or following the audience, and this is true not just in news, but in popular culture in general. Is a compelling TV drama, TVs in quotes, because television does not exist on television anymore, but does it push people to think differently? There's been shows throughout history, from the Mary Tyler Moore Show to The Wire, that are sometimes, giving people new ideas versus just serving up what people want, So I think that's a really important division when we think about what information really does for us. So
I also think about, having worked in the newspaper, what you're judged on. And this was based off of headquarters. And at one point, it was based off of clicks. So to announce how many honorees we had a single picture. And people probably remember this from like BuzzFeed and stuff. You have to like click through every one because the amount of clicks is what they can sell to an advertiser. And then at some point, it kind of changed to page views. But it's all tied back to how to make money.
Yep.
It's not necessarily like, I mean, yes, they want more viewers, but they want more viewers so they can make more money.
Yeah. And this is something we would have talked about when you were an undergrad. And I learned when I first learned about media, like, if you want to understand how messages and information comes to us, you have to step back and say that, let's say journalism in particular, we could pick a lot of different ways that information comes to us, but journalism, news, we have to understand how it's organized and how it's structured, because the structure of it, and, we use these words like, oh, structural, like they fell out of the sky, like, oh, structural racism, like it's just a new way. Like, no, it actually talks about realities, that the world is organized in particular ways, so if you think about the news, it's organized in particular ways. Certainly it's a profession. Certainly journalists are trained on the job and in journalism school. And certainly they, are out there trying to get ethical, good information. But you have to understand that its context is a profit motive. It is a for-profit industry, And again, I think sometimes when you have professors talking like this, we're free from market concerns here in the academy, that we can make these arguments. It sounds like it's a critique. When you name something that is kind of so embedded in what it is, it sounds like you are saying that it shouldn't be that way. So saying that news is for profit, it sounds to people like, oh, are you saying that it shouldn't be? Well, I'm not necessarily saying that it should be, but you have to understand that that's how it's operating.
Right.
In the same way with healthcare, right? Healthcare in the United States is a for-profit industry. So that shapes the entirety of the industry from corporate strategy down to care of a patient. It doesn't determine the care of the patient. It doesn't guarantee that the patient is going to receive this kind of care, but it shapes everything, to kind of lead to particular kinds of outcomes. And the same thing goes with the news, so we don't know that because we can't guarantee that because news is a for-profit endeavor, that the news will always be supporting for-profit, status quo, easy politics, keep everything the same, make things predictable, things that are good for business. Business wants predictability. Business wants stability. So that doesn't, just because news is for-profit doesn't mean that news is going to kind of always tilt in our information in that direction. But it means that it's going to kind of put it in that context and put it in that place. So I think that that's a really important way to understand it, because all the things you were talking about, clicks, likes, I have another former student who worked as an investigative reporter for BuzzFeed, and BuzzFeed at the time was moving from clicks to engagement. This maybe was 10 years ago. So it's like, I was talking to him about being an investigative reporter. I'm like, when he first went there, I'm like, BuzzFeed doing investigative reporting, again, this was 10 years ago. Yeah. And he explained to me, the whole model was changing at the time to time that a reader spent. And so, journalism and news, it's always trying to work, but it's working in a certain kind of context, so the question about, whether or not the news is following us or leading us, I think first of all, you need interest from people about what's happening. And journalism should give us information that we need. It should. In the classic Jeffersonian sense of democracy, like you have to have an educated public in order for the republic to function in democratic spirit. Like people need to have a sense of what's going on if they're going and verifiably going on. If we're to make decisions together about what we should do. And where we're at now is so far from that. And we're in a real pickle.
Such a nice way to put it. Okay, one other thing I want to ask about how media is changing. How is your teaching changing? We talked a little bit about kind of the influence of AI and are they writing? And I don't know, I guess, how are you teaching this material differently, especially kind of with the divisiveness and how they have access to everything?
Yeah, I think that they do. I think young people know all the things that we would try to help them understand about media, journalism, information, public issues. They have access to how those things are happening, but they don't have access to the information. So we talked about, there was just at the time of this recording, we just had a political assassination where Charlie Kirk was killed. And so I had class the next day, and we I came in and I just started asking them about it, because I'm not shying away from issues.
Yeah.
And I said, what are you seeing out there? And people were saying, well, the students said, there sure is a lot of people saying some crazy things. And, the students started talking. It was pretty clear that critics of Charlie Kirk were saying some pretty mean things, and supporters of Charlie Kirk's story were saying mean things. This is where the students were saying all the way around. There's just like a lot of bad stuff that they were saying on social media. And I asked them, like, well, why do you think you're saying all that stuff? And we talked about what social media does to get engagement, use algorithms to privilege, the kind of what ends up being some of the more incendiary messages because it gets people's attention. And, I said, who's seen messages about forgiveness? Nobody, right? It's just not, those stories don't really float to the surface. So I think that thinking about these things critically with young people, they're already there in terms of they know the game. They know really what's happening. They understand algorithms. At least they understand that they're there. But to kind of like bring a different way of thinking about it, because it used to be 15 or 20 years ago when you were teaching about journalism, a lot of students aren't reading the newspaper.
Yeah, I wasn't.
Yeah, that's okay. I think, now nobody does, but,
Right.
but that was where you got information. So now they have a lot of information. It's just people don't necessarily know. And I think young people in my class, and it could be a bigger question, that it's hard to know what information is legitimate, what's important. And so I think there's a bigger need for media literacy to know like what's verifiable. But I think there's an even larger responsibility to understand that we're in a moment where verifiability itself, like truth seeking, is being undermined. I think that this has shown up a little bit in the business community with we don't need quarterly reports, which is something that was floated recently, and I knew a lot of business people are like, yeah, we kind of rely on this information. Yeah. I think we have a bigger responsibility to be more vigilant about verifiable information and how it's verifiable and why it's important to have verifiable information.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, you've done a good job kind of explaining how media has changed over the years and talked about the Charlie Kirk situation. We are obviously so divided, and media is a huge reason for that. Did you see this intense division coming as a scholar of media?
I have to be honest, I didn't. And there's certain things, and I don't want to pin this on, just Donald Trump or what Trumpism represents, or on, kind of the failures of neoliberalism, in terms of supporting working people as it was espoused by Democrats and Republicans for a long time. There's a big consensus about that. So I don't really want to put it to anything. I mean, we're just like in this environment where we're reckoning with political populism. And
say more about that.
Yeah. So, I was talking to students last semester. Was my media and conflict class. I've taught that, taught it on 9/11. I taught it with you when we were talking. There was probably like skirmishes in Iraq and things like that still happening, and like the Fukushima disaster. I've taught that class through so many tragedies and wars and things like that. Last semester, when the second Trump administration began, that was the hardest semester I've ever had teaching.
Really? Wow.
By far. The class went well. The students were great, but I had a very hard time getting my head around how to teach fair. I teach fair. I don't give my opinion, unless something comes up that is a very clear.
Unless it's about bike lanes.
Unless it's about bike lanes. Yes, cycling. I'm strong feelings about that, but I think the responsibility of the professor for college students is to kind of open things up, but you also have to corral, if things aren't the case or not verifiable, then it's your responsibility to kind of bring it back to the center of what we know and what's verifiable. But I was asking my students, I said, this isn't a political science class, but I did left and right on the board. I still use a board. And I said, what are some traditional, like if we're just talking in general terms, if you're at a cocktail party, what are some typical attributes of kind of left of center, left-wing, progressive, liberal, And, students were saying, well, expansion of rights, kind of expansive, kind of change-oriented, basic things. And then we were on the conservative side, said, what about just traditional conservatism, like more restrained, more cautious about granting new rights because of the change that might bring, smaller government, smaller apparatus, kind of valuing things for as they are and how as they have been in tradition. And so, okay, that's about right in a general sense. And I said, Trumpism, where do you put that? You know? And I had one student in the front, kind of not a communication major, say, wait, why are you saying Trumpism? And I couldn't really hear him. And I said, what? He's like, just repeat yourself. And he's like, Trumpism, like racism and sexism.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm like, oh. I said, oh, no. He was like, like it's something that's bad. I'm like, oh, no. We're not saying it's bad. It's just a way of describing something as a kind of phenomenon, So I asked the students, where would you put Trumpism? I said, is it liberal or left of center? And they're like, no. I mean, is it conservative? No. Okay, so what is it? And it's populist. They read this piece by a journalism scholar, Silvio Wasteboard. It's pretty terrific. He studied mostly left-wing populist movements in Latin America. Okay. And he made arguments about what populism does. Populism's kind of agnostic to left or right. Like that political populism is difficult on democratic communication.
Is populism just, how would you describe that? Just a popular idea that people are following that's not neither left nor right?
It's a little bit more than that. It's like drawing on the people to gain political power, and you kind of end up speaking on their behalf. So I think it's not a lowercase populism, like we need a progressive populist policy here in Seattle, or we need to kind of really listen to the people. The way that populism works, like capital P politically, and again, I defer to a political scientist, but a lot of my readings, particularly related to journalism and democratic communication, it does three things. And this is according to Wasteboard in his big study of left-wing populist movements in Latin America. It unifies the people, and it unifies the people who we are, and it unifies who they are.
Yeah.
And then it kind of engages in a politics of perpetual conflict between us and them. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing, and the most germane for our conversation, is that it undermines, and it undermines truth and truth-seeking institutions, and it casts truth and truth-seeking institutions as another tool of the elites that works against the people. And so the populace, often a demagogue, will, kind of be the leader of populism. It will really kind of represent the people against the elites. I think, again, without assigning value to it, because it works for a lot of people, that Trumpism represents a kind of right-wing populism more than I think any of the other terms that a lot of people throw around pretty easily.
Yeah.
Other people are saying, oh, it's authoritarian. Well, I think it speaks the language of authoritarianism, and it might be kind of on a trajectory of authoritarianist, in that direction, but it's not authoritarian. Some people will disagree with me. Other people say, oh, it's fascist. Well, it's not, I don't think it earns that moniker.
Yeah.
We'll see. But I think it's better to understand it as populist. And I think that even supporters of the president and this movement would recognize that it's populist, and that's probably part of the reasons they like it. So it just becomes, we haven't had a sustained populist movement in the United States in a very, very long time. And so it just kind of, it's a hard thing to get your head around, so the kind of attack on universities, on journalism, on corporate reporting. These are all kind of like part of a way that the movement is attempting to kind of stand up for the people against all these pointy-headed data, whose data for who, these kinds of questions. So for those of us who are inside of truth-seeking institutions, whether it's a corporate boardroom or a newspaper or a radio station or a university or an NGO, just becomes very difficult to navigate.
Where I get hung up, because I can understand that, is that Trump represents billionaires. And one of my questions was going to be, why is the division so much between left and right? And why can't we get it more between the 1% and the working class? How come that division hasn't played out that way? But it sounds like you're kind of saying it sort of has in the subset, right?
I think it has in a subset. And you could look back at, I think two movements, one on each side, that were effective in very different ways. So some people remember the Occupy movement.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, Occupy Wall Street.
That, yes.
I mean, it's easy to forget about. It seems like a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago. But that was you could draw lines to support of Bernie Sanders from a lot of the people who became kind of political or politically aware or contributed to these, left wing, we are the 99%, that's a very class based, broad based critique. And yeah, I think that it probably fed a lot of energy into, I think, interest in Bernie Sanders' messages and some interest in democratic socialism, but it really didn't do anything. And if you look at another kind of popular movement, which would be the Tea Party movement, which, you could say, well, that was really a reaction against the first black president, or, what was that all about? But I mean, there was real grievance about neoliberalism and liberal institutions, like universities and the government and government agencies, and they took over the government. So there's different ways to think about how movements can progress and what they can do. These were kind of class-based movements. We're much more into an identity place, and this is both on the left and the right. All the criticisms of cancel culture on the left and, so-called wokeism, like it was very much, I think, about identity and about guarantees about identity. And a lot of, I think, the energy that Trumpism has drawn from is also about identity.
Yeah.
People if you looked at, protests in 2020, the kind of racial reckoning after George Floyd's murder, there's an aesthetic to that protest. And some of it's out of necessity because of the masks, and it was still 2020, but, it was also communal.
Yeah.
And it was cultural. And I think if you look at, January 6th, you look at the costumes from January 6th rioters, or the kind of flags and aesthetics of Trumpism, it's very much, it's an identity. So we're a long ways from a kind of class-based economic solidarity.
Yeah. That is interesting that we don't bond with people in our similar class. We bond on a lot of other things.
That's right. And I think that, how we get information has a lot to do with it.
Oh,
we are in absolute echo chambers. We get affirmed in our view, and people are so not familiar with actually not just messages from somebody, messages that go against our opinions, but messages that have deeper rationales, because everything is arriving on the surface. So it's really hard to get, like if you don't want a public option for healthcare, then how do you see solving this problem? And it's hard if we don't agree. It's hard to even know because we don't understand. This was I think this was a hopeful moment. I think especially after the 2020 election, people were kind of saying, what was that all about? And I think some of the better analyses of like Donald Trump's first term and then Biden winning and kind of what that started to look like, but I think there was a lot of people who didn't support Donald Trump who were really kind of like starting to be curious. What stories are we missing? Like what kind of hurt and pain did that speak to? And I think that was a good impulse because there's a lot of people who feel left behind by the universities, by journalists, by the economy, by Hollywood, frankly.
Yeah.
And, that causes some disassociation, some pain.
Yeah.
I think at this point, we're kind of past that. It's its own thing.
Yeah, it's morphing into its own thing. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about covering conflict. So one thing you mentioned was 9/11. And in your syllabus, you kind of talk about how journalism changed after 9/11. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think after 9/11, there was a number of, it changed everything for us. We're still going through security.
Sure.
Some of us remember walking right to the gate,
Right.
So, like a lot of tragedies, some of it wears off over time, but I think that it's enough of a defining event and it has enough of like a real actual consequence for it to be still deeply felt. At the time, there were scholars of journalism who suggested that journalism will be forever changed. And again, they didn't see the technological and audience changes that were just
saying no.
Yeah, it's like hard. It reminds me a little bit when phones started having cameras. They started in Japan, and like they were going to come to the United States. I don't even know when, the early 2000s. And the big concern about phones with cameras was that you could take them into a dressing room. You could take them into a locker room.
Oh.
Like that seems so silly, compared to what the smartphone has become. It's just dominated.
Well, it is still an issue now, but that's interesting that was like our main concern.
That was the main concern.
Yeah.
That was the main concern.
Wow.
Yeah. So there were scholars who thought that journalism would be forever changed. And one of the things they thought is that journalism couldn't separate itself from the body politic in the way that it had before.
Saying like you don't think people were capable of being neutral anymore? I
think part of it is about, I think that's not what they originally thought, but I think that's ended up what occurred. And that goes to like a second point. This is a journalism scholar, James Carey, who I'm thinking of. The body politic being that like journalism had to be engaged in politics. So at 9/11, they had to find file footage of Al-Qaeda because there were no reporters in Afghanistan. There were some big issues that summer in Afghanistan. They destroyed this ancient Buddha statue. The Taliban did. So there's a little bit of stories, but mostly journalists weren't covering global affairs. It was like it's expensive to have a reporter near Afghanistan. So Carey, the critic, thought that after 9/11, journalism would have to be deeply invested in the body politic, like our issues together, the things that we need to know about, the things that we need to discuss, the information that we need to be able to make decisions, because this was such a glaring event that I would force journalists out of scandal, out of the politics of the personal, and into what we were talking about earlier, the information that we need to make decisions. The other thing that Carey thought in particular, he was like a giant of a journalism scholar, was that, that the veil of patriotism descended upon the media. And some people may remember, started with Fox News, but every cable news network had the kind of ticker.
Oh, the
news ticker. Mm-hmm. And then some of them had flags waving there. And then some of the reporters started wearing flag pins.
Oh.
So, the idea was that there's so much patriotism that journalists felt as though they needed to show that's probably going to be a feature of our news media going forward. And I think that's absolutely played out. And not just in what we think about the news media, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, right? Kind of playing to their audiences, and Fox generating an incredible amount of revenue because their audience is the demographic who watches cable TV, becoming the number one, and ultimately just becoming, kind of like an instrument for a political movement. But also like in podcasting, in other sources, maybe Substack, where we just subscribe to the things that we agree with. And so I think that was about right. I think the first thing that I mentioned about journalism after 9/11 not being able to be separated from the body politic, I think that fell apart pretty quick. It goes along with the kind of news finds me. We don't get a lot of information. People, I should say, it's out there. Mm-hmm. There are journalists doing incredible work across all kinds of different outlets, independent, at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, like great people doing good work. But it's much harder to find folks who are attentive to these things, and a lot of that has to do with news finds me and just the mode of social media. I mean, there's a lot of criticism when Twitter started, at least in academic circles, about like, whatever it used to be. I don't even remember 32 characters, 64 characters. How are you supposed to get any information in that? And just think that was a concern, and we're just in a whole different place.
Yeah. Now we're doing a lot faster.
And I don't want to be pessimistic.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is there's great information out there. And I think that if you're curious, especially about ideas that you disagree with, and again, this isn't trying to be milquetoast. I don't like the idea like we should all just love each other. I think that we should love each other, but I think we should be able to disagree passionately and with respect. But it's hard to disagree with someone, like legitimately, thoroughly, in an adult way, disagree if you don't really understand where they're coming from.
Well, and if you're both getting different information.
And if you're getting different information, that becomes impossible.
Yeah. Well, I want to move a little bit to trust and how to trust the media. And you talked about Fox News. That was one of my questions. I vividly remember in your class, we talked about Fox News and how it was actually an entertainment company. It was not a news company. And you showed some examples, and this just felt like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Why did that not... Were you the only one teaching that class? Like, why did this not translate to the general public? And why does the general public still think of it as a news station?
Oh, those are big questions.
Categorically, it's an entertainment company.
I know. If I had the answer, I should be a political strategist and make a lot of money. I think I'd do great. It's such a good question. I mean, there's things that we know about that we ignore.
Yeah.
We know that we probably shouldn't be driving as much or using fossil fuels or even that electric cars are kind of just a solution that preserves our individualism, that we should probably live with more density, more walkable neighborhoods. We know we should. We know that the food system, we should probably rethink the food system, and we should come up with alternatives. We know that we should probably be much more thoughtful about screens and children and social media and preteens and teenagers. But I mean, these are all things that we know about, but they're hard to do. And so, because it gives us so much. And I think that Fox News and the other problems with CNN and MSNBC and the various, other outlets, like, I think we know them, but they're giving us what we want.
Yeah.
And in some ways we know we shouldn't be an addict on this drug, but golly, it sure does feel good.
Sure, it's good, yeah.
So, I mean, I think why we don't act different, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the sense of belonging that, let's say, that Fox News gives its audience. And I think that might sound very soft and very snowflakey, but the United States is a place of mobility. People don't always live close to their families. Our geography can be isolating, especially if we're in the suburbs or the exurbs or live in a rural community. We just don't see a lot of people. We're very individualistic. So an idea that there's a place I can go where I feel like I belong is very seductive.
Mm-hmm. Belonging and identity, kind of what you talked about. One thing I wanted to ask you when this was all starting out is the big fake news, the start of that being popular. I'm actually curious. I wonder if that feeling started before we knew it as fake news and being popular. Do you have some insight as to when we started not trusting the media?
Yeah, there's the journalism scholar Michael Schudson wrote a piece a few years ago where he's like, we shouldn't trust the media. Oh. That we used to trust we used to trust what was afforded to journalists when they were like stenographers in the 40s and 50s. They would just say, here's what the senator said. Oh. Here's where this happened. So trust is about, okay, that is what they said, right? And journalism has changed since then, the 60s all the way to today. It's much more interpretive. It's much more analytical. Journalists make connections with things. So if you ever read a piece, let's say in the New York Times or online, and it might be labeled news analysis, that's when and journalistic outlets, used to be pretty purposeful about labeling them as such, because the journalist wouldn't just be telling you the things that happened or providing, different layers of fact and information that's verified, but the analytic pieces draw connections. And when you draw connections, you're going off of just the fact train. You're putting into a larger context, which is very important. If you think about the stories that 60 Minutes would tell, 60 Minutes, I don't know where it's at now, but for a very long time, when people used to watch network television, was the highest rated program for decades. And those were long stories. They were 10, 12, 15-minute stories. Some of you remember watching at your grandparents or, if it's on a Sunday. Part of it is because they did that interpretive work. They talked to different people. They put things into a bigger context. And that's really good information that we tend to remember that kind of information. So we've lost a lot of that kind of context. And so we get things in little pieces.
I also wonder if part of what's playing into this is that there are more journalists. And I've also thought about, some people have called me a journalist, and I always say, like, no, I just like to talk shit about the news. I don't know if I'm a journalist. You don't take a test to be qualified for a journalist. And so you have these people on TikTok that are seen, or not even TikTok, writing articles on different websites and blogs and things like that maybe can be seen as fake news because they aren't doing the same due diligence or what have you. Would you agree with that?
I think that there's, I want to talk a little bit more about fake news in a second, but there is different ways to do journalism, and journalism isn't the same as information. Anybody can create information or say something, but journalism, it ought to be ethical. It ought to be accountable. It ought to seek truth. It ought to take responsibility, but lots of people can do that. An example would be right now, there is a website and a social media account, LA Taco. And it started as a Chicano taco review food review website, and they have been at the forefront of documenting ICE raids in Los Angeles.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They are getting a lot of attention for the kind of community-based reporting that they're doing. It went from a taco review website to kind of like one of the best places you can get information about ICE's activities in Los Angeles, which is useful, ethical, verifiable. Fake news is, interestingly enough, when you were a student in my class for a number of years, I used to talk about fake news. It was a kind of fun conversation at the end of the semester, and fake news talked about satire. So Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, Stephen Colbert's The Colbert Report, The Onion, this is what fake news was. Fake news was interesting because it had become in the 2000s through various, the 2004, 2008 election, a lot of national issues. It became a lot of young people, there were polling that said young people trusted quote unquote fake news more than real news. Yeah, because the satire respected the intelligence as well as the information that its audience had. So you had to understand what was happening in the world in order to get the joke. And audiences at the time felt respected, whereas, the 6 o'clock news would say, oh, welcome to your day. You don't know anything. Here's what happened today. So I've been teaching fake news since 2001. Okay. But it is something.
You've been teaching it since before it was cool.
Right. Yeah. So when Donald Trump started using the term fake news to describe anything that he didn't like, it became a very different thing. It became a charge, a political charge, had political currency. And now we're in a very different place where disinformation campaigns and the spread of misinformation is highly consequential and very, very common. Then you start adding artificial intelligence and fake images and things like that. Like, it's hard to see a way out of this big question about what is actually happening.
So that's not great, because in my spiral last week, that's what I was thinking is because I read Careless People. I don't know if you've heard about it, about kind of Facebook and what's happening there. And I also felt like I don't see a way out of this. I want to say that there's going to be a tipping point, but I don't know. I want to give you a chance to comment if you feel like it. I just learned about Jimmy Kimmel being canceled. Do you want to comment on how that's? Yeah,
I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm not, I remember Jimmy Kimmel from The Man Show. I don't really watch late night TV, so I haven't really kept track of his career. So in some ways, I'm kind of like, okay, well, when I first heard the news, I'm like, oh, that's
right. Why should I care?
Yeah, why should I care? I had read a little bit more about it, and it is profoundly alarming. This was pressure from the chair of the Federal Communication Commission, and this is the leader of a government agency who essentially said, and the quote is, we could do this the easy way or the hard way. Okay. So, which is, the government cannot censor, a speaker on television. They can threaten there's all kinds of rules the FCC has imposed over the years about language or nudity or, all these kinds of things. And they could be fined, or they're the broadcasting licenses of local stations that are using the electromagnetic spectrum to get their message out, could be pulled. But it's not a role. The government does not censor speech. And here you have a government agent, a bureaucrat, a political appointee who's in charge of the FCC using mob language. That's mob language. To essentially compel, ABC, Disney to do their bidding to silence speech. I've heard some defense of this, which mirrors some people on the left who defended cancel culture. You can say whatever you want, but you might not be able to do it on a television show.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah. But this was from the FCC chair. And so the one thing I'll say about it is that people should be reading a lot about this. And, there's lots of red lines in terms of democratic norms that have been crossed, and they continue to be crossed. People on the left and people on the right are going to have to decide what to do with this. If it serves them or disserves them, it doesn't change the radical departure from what we expect out of government and the institution. So there's got to be a kind of reckoning. I'm not sure I know less about this, but I think it's really important to follow the story because this is as close as I've seen in a very long time of like, direct government.
Yeah,
censorship.
I also need to do a little more research. Where my brain went first is I know Nexstar is trying to acquire Tegna, and I know that with big acquisitions, they will do anything to get that for the government to approve this big acquisition. I don't know if that's the case here, but that's where my brain went first is were they trying to make some sort of deal with the government, and this was something they had to do to get something else that's going to be later on down the road. We might hear of some big merger or something like that.
I mean, highly likely.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been depressing. Anything I want to switch over to talking about college before we close out. But is there anything else that you want to say before I do that?
Yeah, I think we're in a tough spot right now. But the key is to be vigilant. And I think as depressing as things are around information and how we use information and how it's important to business and to democracy and culturally, I think that vigilance, and I think this is going to lead to our next topic. But I think staying vigilant, not being reactionary, but understanding what's happening, keep track of what's happening. And in our own work, trying to stand up for what's verifiable in the ways that we have authority over it. I think, that's a good reflex given the things that are happening right now.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so college. I feel like, I don't know where this is coming from, but I feel like people are saying we don't need it anymore. It's too expensive. I do think it's very expensive. I do think the job market is very different these days. I do think that you can go into trade, and also getting a degree doesn't mean you're immediately going to get a job. I also still think college is extremely important for reasons that are not just about a job. It's for reasons that you're developing as a human and developing critical thinking skills. But what would you say back to some of those critics?
Yeah, I think some of them are very good points. I think the sticker price has gotten expensive. To operate a university is very expensive. It's gotten complex. Leaders of higher education sound more like CEOs than educators. Universities they have lots of constituencies. I think that we're in a tough spot in terms of what how universities operate. At the same time, it's hard to think of an institution in the United States and a sector that is as effective globally as the higher education sector in essentially producing a workforce. If you just think about it on terms of those kinds of ways, sure. that is prepared to do high level professional work. Now, I think it's important to note that that's not really why universities exist. Universities exist and have for 1,000 years in terms of the Western university to create and disseminate knowledge. And it just so happens that the process of creating and disseminating knowledge and all of its poetics and all the complexities and the deep dive that undergraduates kind of take in a 4-year university produces job-ready skills. But it's not the way that people think. And I think one of the biggest problems with kind of the approach to higher education among high schoolers, among parents, or among college students, is that we're in a radically instrumentalist phase of how people think about colleges and universities. And I saw this change in 2008 with the financial crisis. So more students were focusing more on what they're going to get out of it. And certainly since 2020, we've seen more and more students who are purely pre-professional in how they think about higher education. And universities have responded. They have changed themselves to become kind of
like creating courses that are about interviewing and job training and all that.
Yeah, and schools and endowed chairs about kind of practical professional questions. Now, there's a need for this,
sure.
But at the same time, if college is only about job training and kind of vocational preparation, it is a very expensive and long way to do it.
Seriously, yes.
And college is about, and I'll talk about cost in a second, but college is about really creating a habit of mind.
A habit of mind.
A habit of mind, a way to think about yourself and a way to think about things and a way to think about others. And again, the content, it's not ideological in terms of like, here's what you're supposed to think, but it's really kind of, and I think this is very true, it's about how to approach things. And it does so over the course of kind of, a kind of soaking over time where you can develop a skill set around critically reading information, critically speaking about information, critically writing about things, analysis, being able to identify patterns, interpretation. What are the meanings of those patterns? What does it mean to evaluation? Is this helpful or hurtful? Does it have benefits? What's the cost? Engagement with ideas. No matter what you study in college, if it's a good school and if you're really focused on who you're becoming, because I think college needs young people to be serious about themselves, take themselves seriously. It doesn't mean you have to be X or Y or Z, but I'm here to grow. And then to be able to take ideas seriously, even the ideas that you disagree with or ideas that you aren't easy for you, like I'm not a math person. Well, go find the way that math is interesting. Regardless of whatever you study, you could study literature, you could study economics, you could study communication, you could study political science, you could study anthropology. If you're getting these things in the context of an actual like disciplinary way of thinking, a practiced way of thinking, that's what would make anthropology a discipline. It's like a practiced way of thinking about the human experience. But if you can come out really kind of thinking about that analysis, interpretation, reading, writing, like you are ready to contribute to professional work because you have been vetted to be flexible, to be able to stick with things that you're not good at, to be experimental, to be the one who raises the critical question, to be the person who's not afraid to express the new idea, to be the person who's confident in themselves enough to know that there'll be another job if I have to put it on the line,
Mm-hmm.
And I went to my neighborhood. Very few of us have college degrees, and they're smart folks and they're great folks and they can do all of these things too. But it's not. College is a stamp that says if you've done this right, you are ready for anything. The problem with so many young people being purely instrumentalists in how they're thinking about their major and their job from 17, right, and just sticking through to it. That's really not the way that career paths work, but
Right.
That's the dominant belief, is that often they close themselves up from the actual learning and growth that happens in college. So you end up with your degree from a great major. It's, ranked, and you might have had a nice little internship that confirms everything that you've done, but you haven't been on your heels.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't had the growth zone. You haven't really had to stick with the things that you and do well in the things that you're not good at. That is what every job asks you, to do well at things that you're not good at, to find a way.
Mm-hmm.
So is it worth it? It's absolutely worth it if you want the chance, the opportunity to kind of deep dive into a habit of mind that's a professional habit of mind. I'll just say one thing about cost, because I have a child in college now and went through the whole application process with her and watched and rooted for her. And a lot of listeners probably who've been through this experience, have learned a lot. It's an arbitrary number, tuition price, and so most campuses, I'm thinking about private schools in particular, a lot of times people don't apply to the University of San Diego or to Bard College, or to Occidental or Seattle U because look at how much it costs. Vast majority of students get financial aid. Usually privates, in my experience, the typical financial aid package renders the private school about the same as the flagship public school.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a lot of money, then you're going to probably pay the sticker. And usually the way it works is the universities and colleges, they try to find out there's enough people who can pay the full price who won't see it as unusual and can totally afford it.
Mm-hmm.
You need to get enough of those people because you need to apply a fund with financial aid everybody else who can't afford it. So it's kind of a careful balance. But, the universities haven't done a very good job in communicating the value of it. So even I think the liberal arts is the greatest job readiness approach. The breadth, the freedom that comes with it, all the things that I talked about. But just but being defensive about the liberal arts, I just don't think that really gets us anywhere. But really thinking more critically about the kind of deep transformational experience that a university education can provide.
It kind of speaks to what we as a society value. And I think I said this in my guest lecture about how many people value money and, oh, you're doing this project. What are you going to make from it? Oh, you're going to college. What's your job going to be? And I think as a society, we're valuing that more than the development of a human mind just for the development of it. because capitalism. And so
I think so. And I think that your story that you shared with the students, it kind of goes and shows, like that if you follow your interest, you're going to do fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want right away, and I think a lot of life is understanding like the things that you think you want. Actually, look all around you, your life. That's the beautiful part of it. But, if you follow your interest, you're probably going to do pretty well. If you're a hard worker, if you're bright. And I think the same goes for deciding what to study. Follow your interest.
Yeah.
One of the things and this will be the last thing I say about this, but one of the things that I have honor students in this class that you just taught. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I told them when they began, I said, so one of the first things I want to tell you is the grade game is over. Mm. The grade game is over. I said, everything you've done until this point is really about the grade. You've had learning management software telling you to the day what your score is. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Focus on what you're learning and how you're becoming. And the truth of the matter is, good grades come with focusing on yourself, being interested in things, But I think that so many young people lose out only focusing on their grade, their major, their job,
I think that translates to people my age and all around because we're focused on the next promotion. We want to climb up that corporate ladder. It feels very similar to trying to get the grades. And then you kind of realize like, oh, do I want to climb this corporate ladder? Am I feeling good about myself by this validation? So that exercise, I think, applies to a lot of other people too.
I think so, and there's something to be said for driven people, and like people have a vision and
sure, it's not a bad thing
and do it, and there's something to be said for some people who are on pretty straight trajectories and awesome, but I think anecdotally, and I think a lot of studies show, like most people find their way professionally in ways that were unexpected.
Yeah.
And so I think that the real risk is not that you're not going to be able to do the thing you're going to do. The risk is you're going to put so much pressure on yourself that you're going to end up in a really difficult psychological place because you feel so much pressure. And so following your interest and being serious about it, and taking things serious and taking yourself serious, even serious about how you're going to have fun and the side projects you're going to take up, it's a great thing for young people to kind of understand and hear stories like yours, that you can do some pretty great things, if you let yourself do them.
Yes, thank you. Okay, well, Del Rio, this has been what a dream come true to full circle come back to my campus and both speak and be able to interview you. I love sitting here because I would give anything to sit back in your classes. I think now, especially now that I want to actually sit and learn. I think before, obviously, it was stressful and I was trying to get the good grades. But I love what you had to say today about the media and your honesty. And again, just thank you for taking the time.
Well, thanks. I think Weekly is a wonderful classroom that you lead.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, let's go get a drink at the campus bar, huh?
Let's do it.
This has been The Weekly, with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.